You got all those books, the Bible, the different Gospels and stuff that people are quite familiar with. Half the time, they didn't even need to read the subtitles. They could look at it and know what was going on.
Mel Gibson spent years researching the most raw and authentic version of the Jesus story before creating The Passion of the Christ. But what he kept returning to wasn't the familiar Western Bible. Instead, it was the Ethiopian Bible, an 81-book collection largely untouched by centuries of edits from Rome, the Reformation, and beyond. What it contains paints a very different picture than most people expect. Do you believe these hidden texts could change how we understand the story? Yes or no? Let us know in the comments. 2 different libraries. Most people raised in the Western Christian tradition know a Bible with 66 books. It feels complete and natural because it is so familiar. But it is not the only version. It is not even the oldest version still in use today. The Bible we know survived a long series of decisions. Church leaders in Rome and Constantinople made choices about which books belonged. Later, leaders of the Protestant Reformation made more choices. Each time, certain texts were removed or pushed aside. The books that stayed were the ones that fit the needs of whoever was in charge. The Ethiopian Orthodox Bible contains 81 books. That is 15 more than the Western Protestant version. These extra books are not late additions or minor texts. Several of them are among the oldest writings in the entire Judeo-Christian tradition. They circulated widely among Jewish and early Christian communities for centuries, before any council ever voted on what was official. Ethiopia received these texts in the 4th century. That transmission bypassed Rome completely. The Ethiopian Church has held on to these books ever since, through the Crusades, through the Reformation, through the Enlightenment, through the age of colonialism. They survived because Ethiopia itself survived. It was never colonized. Its church was never pressured to change by outside powers. No foreign institution ever had the authority to reach in and reshape what the Ethiopian church kept or discarded. This matters more than it might first appear. Every library reflects the hands that built it. The Western Bible was shaped by specific institutions with specific goals across many centuries. The Ethiopian Bible was shaped by different hands, for different purposes, across a different history. The result is not a random or accidental difference. It is a deep structural difference in what gets emphasized and what gets left out. These 2 libraries do not represent 2 different religions. Both are rooted in the same tradition. Both center on the same figure. But a lens ground by different hands shows a different image. The Ethiopian Bible offers a version of that tradition that was never filtered through the councils and reformations that shaped the West. What it reveals about the central figure of Christianity is meaningfully different from what most Western Christians were taught. This is not a story about which version is correct. It is a story about how texts survive and why. It is a story about power, about which institutions got to decide what was sacred and what was not. The 66-book Bible feels like the obvious and complete form of Christian scripture, because Western culture has treated it that way for centuries. But completeness is not the same as familiarity. The Ethiopian Church preserved something the West set aside. What was set aside and why it was set aside is a question worth sitting with. What the physical Jesus actually looked like. The image of Jesus that has dominated Western culture for roughly 1,000 years is a product of European artistic tradition, not of any historical or textual description. Pale skin, straight or lightly wavy hair, blue or light-colored eyes, the general physical features of a northern Mediterranean or northern European man. This image has been so thoroughly embedded in Western cultural production that many people who know intellectually that a first-century Jewish man from Galilee would not have looked like a 14th-century Flemish painting, still carry the painted version as their default mental image. The Ethiopian manuscripts do not carry that image. They never received it because the artistic tradition that produced it developed in Europe after the Ethiopian Church had already established its own visual vocabulary for representing the central figures of the faith. The Ethiopian manuscript tradition depicts Jesus with bronzed skin, with hair described in the tradition as like wool, tightly coiled and dense, with eyes described in terms drawn from the Book of Revelation as like fire, not soft or gentle but intense and penetrating. The figure in Ethiopian manuscript illustration is African in his visual characteristics in a way that the artistic tradition rendering him reflects the geography and population of the region where that tradition developed. The Kebra Nagast, one of the most important texts in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, provides a theological framework for connecting the Jesus lineage directly to Africa through a specific historical and genealogical argument. The Queen of Sheba, in the Kebra Nagast's account, is an Ethiopian queen named Makeda who travels to Jerusalem, meets Solomon, conceives a son by him, and returns to Ethiopia where that son, Menelik, eventually travels back to Jerusalem and returns to Ethiopia with the Ark of the Covenant. The lineage that runs from Solomon through Menelik to the Ethiopian royal house is understood in this tradition as the same lineage that runs through David to Jesus, making the connection between the Ethiopian royal tradition and the divine lineage not metaphorical but genealogical and physical. This is not a peripheral claim in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. It is foundational. The Kebra Nagast is not a supplementary text consulted by specialists. It is the document that explains Ethiopia's understanding of its own place in sacred history, and its account of the Queen of Sheba's encounter with Solomon and the lineage that resulted from it is as central to Ethiopian Christianity as the Nativity narrative is to Western Christianity. The Garma Gospels. In a monastery in northern Ethiopia, in a region that has been continuously inhabited by Christian monks since the 4th century, there are manuscripts that are among the oldest illustrated Christian documents in the world. The Garma Gospels, named for one of the 9 saints who brought Christianity to Ethiopia in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, have been dated by radiocarbon analysis to somewhere between 330 and 650 AD. That range places them among the earliest surviving illustrated gospel manuscripts anywhere, predating most of the European manuscript tradition by centuries. They exist not as relics of a lost world but as living objects, still housed in the monastery for which they were made, still part of an active religious community. What makes the Garma Gospels significant is not only their age, but their condition and their visual content. They survived without the interruptions that reshaped the European manuscript tradition. The Protestant Reformation, which destroyed enormous quantities of pre-Reformation manuscript art in Northern Europe on the grounds that visual representation of sacred figures was idolatrous, did not reach the monasteries of northern Ethiopia. The Enlightenment's critical reframing of religious texts as historical documents subject to rational scrutiny rather than devotional objects to be venerated did not disrupt the tradition of use these manuscripts were embedded in. They were copied, read, chanted from, and venerated in an unbroken tradition from their creation to the present. The continuity is not incidental. It is the thing itself. The illustrations in the Garma Gospels reflect their origin. The flora in the border decorations is African. The fauna referenced in the visual vocabulary is the fauna of the Ethiopian highlands. The color palette draws on pigments available in the region, producing a visual world that is recognizably distinct from European manuscript art in every element of its visual vocabulary. The figures depicted are African in their physical characteristics, surrounded by an African natural world, embedded in a visual tradition that developed independently of the European tradition and reflects a completely different relationship between the faith and the geography of the people practicing it. There is no borrowing here, no adaptation of an imported template. The visual language emerged from the place, and the place is visible in every page. This matters because it unsettles a default assumption that most people carry without examining it, that early Christianity looked more or less the way European Christian art taught us to imagine it. The Garma Gospels are a direct refutation of that assumption, produced at a time when the tradition was still young enough that no single culture had yet claimed it as its own. They show us a faith taking visual form in a specific landscape, among specific people, with specific materials, without reference to the tradition that would later come to dominate the historical record. These manuscripts represent what early Christianity looked like before European institutional culture became the dominant filter through which the tradition was transmitted. They are not a curiosity or an alternative. They are evidence of what the tradition was before the filtering, preserved in a form that the filtering never reached. To read them as marginal is to accept the distortion as the original. The Book of Enoch and the Cosmic Christ. The Book of Enoch is one of the most significant texts in the Ethiopian canon and one of the most significant omissions from the Western canon. It was widely circulated in early Jewish and Christian communities, cited by several New Testament authors, and considered authoritative by early Christian writers including Tertullian and Origen. It was excluded from the Western canon in a series of decisions that began in the 4th century and was effectively completed by the time the major Western councils had finished their work. In Ethiopia, it was never excluded, and its continued presence in the canon shapes the Ethiopian understanding of the central figures of the faith in ways that are substantially different from the Western understanding. The Book of Enoch introduces the Watchers, a class of angelic beings who descend to earth, take human partners, and produce offspring that are described as corrupting the human race in ways that go beyond ordinary moral failure. The corruption introduced by the Watchers in this text is not simply the corruption of human behavior through bad example or temptation. It is a structural corruption of the human condition itself, a contamination of the human capacity for relationship with the divine that requires a response operating at the same cosmic scale as the corruption it is addressing. Jesus, understood through the lens of the Book of Enoch, as the Ethiopian tradition uses it, is not primarily a moral teacher offering an improved ethical framework, or a savior providing the mechanism for individual souls to reach a positive afterlife destination. He is a cosmic authority acting at the level of the contamination, addressing not just individual human sin, but the structural spiritual corruption introduced by the Watchers. The Ethiopian tradition understands the Incarnation as an intervention in a cosmic conflict that has been underway since before human history, as most people understand it, and Jesus' authority in that tradition extends to dimensions of reality that the Western framing of his mission does not engage with. The harrowing of hell, the tradition of Jesus descending into the realm of the dead between the crucifixion and the resurrection to liberate those held captive there, is a doctrine present in both Eastern and Western Christianity, but given substantially more weight and detail in the Ethiopian tradition than in most Western theological frameworks. The Ethiopian understanding of this event draws on the cosmic framework provided by the Book of Enoch and presents Jesus not as visiting a metaphorical or spiritual realm, but as conducting a real operation in a real dimension of existence against real opposition. The resurrection, in this framework, is not simply a reversal of death for one individual. It is the consequence and the demonstration of a victory achieved in a conflict that had been underway since the events described in the Book of Enoch. The Ark, the Law, and Tewahdo theology. The theological framework of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church carries a name that reflects its most distinctive characteristic. Tewahdo is a Ge'ez word meaning being made one, referring to the theological position that the divine and human natures of Jesus are not two natures existing in one person, but one unified nature produced by their complete integration. This position was ruled heretical by the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD and has been considered outside the bounds of Orthodox Western Christianity ever since. The Ethiopian Church, outside the jurisdiction of Rome and Constantinople at the time of Chalcedon and for all the centuries since, maintained the Tewahdo position and built its entire theological framework around it. The practical consequence of Tewahdo theology is a different understanding of the relationship between the Old and New Testaments. In most Western Christian theology, the Old Testament is understood as a preparatory period that has been superseded by the New Testament, the Old Covenant replaced by the New, the law fulfilled and therefore no longer binding in the way it was before the fulfillment. In Tewahdo theology, the two testaments are not sequential stages, but one continuous narrative, the same divine will expressed through different forms at different points in a single unbroken story. The dietary laws, the liturgical calendar, the practices of purification and holiness that Western Christianity largely set aside as belonging to the superseded Old Covenant are maintained in the Ethiopian tradition, because the tradition understands them as part of the same continuous expression of divine character, rather than as a preliminary version replaced by something better. Jesus, in this framework, is understood as the living Ark, the embodiment in human form of the divine law that the physical Ark of the Covenant represented in stone and gold. The Ark contained the tablets of the law. Jesus, as the Word made flesh, is the law made present in a human person, not replacing the Ark, but fulfilling what the Ark represented by becoming in himself what the Ark symbolized. The claim that the physical Ark of the Covenant currently resides in Aksum, Ethiopia, in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, is not a fringe belief or a tourist attraction claim in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. It is a central element of the tradition's understanding of its own place in sacred history. The Ark was brought to Ethiopia by Menelik, the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, as described in the Kebra Nagast, and has been guarded by a single monk, the guardian of the Ark, in an unbroken succession to the present day. No outsider has been permitted to view it. The guardian is the only person allowed to enter its chapel. The tradition does not present this as a historical curiosity. It presents it as a current and ongoing reality with direct implications for Ethiopia's understanding of its own sacred status. Holiness in the Ethiopian tradition is not primarily a moral category. It is an energetic one. The presence of the divine, as understood through the Ark tradition and through the broader Ethiopian theological framework, is a physical reality with physical effects that can be dangerous to people who approach it without the proper preparation or standing. The story of Uzzah, who reached out to steady the Ark when it was being transported and died instantly when he touched it, is not treated in the Ethiopian tradition as a puzzling or troubling anomaly in the biblical narrative. It is treated as a straightforward description of how divine holiness behaves when it comes into contact with unprepared human physicality. The language and the resonance. Ge'ez, the ancient Semitic language in which the Ethiopian Orthodox scriptures are written and in which the liturgy of the Church is still conducted, is not a living language in the sense of being spoken as a mother tongue by any community. It is a liturgical language, maintained specifically for the purpose of the Church's worship and the preservation of its texts, in the same way that Latin was maintained in the Roman Catholic Church long after it ceased to be a spoken vernacular. But Ge'ez has a relationship to its liturgical use that researchers studying the Ethiopian tradition have found worth examining carefully. The language was developed and maintained primarily as a spoken and chanted language, not a written and silently read one. The Ethiopian liturgical tradition is built around extended chanting of texts in Ge'ez, with specific melodic traditions for different texts and different liturgical occasions that have been maintained and transmitted through generations of training in the Church's musical schools. The physical production of those sounds by groups of chanters in the stone churches of the Ethiopian highlands creates acoustic environments that those who have experienced them describe in terms that go beyond ordinary musical performance. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved directly from the living rock of the Ethiopian highland plateau in the 12th century, were designed with acoustic properties that amplify and sustain chanted sound in ways that modern acoustic engineers who have examined them describe as sophisticated and intentional. The chambers were not simply carved to provide covered space for worship. They were carved to shape sound in specific ways, to create environments in which the human voice chanting the Ge'ez liturgy would be transformed by its interaction with the stone into something that participants experience as qualitatively different from ordinary sound. The chin, the system of double-meaning poetry used in Ethiopian liturgical and scholarly tradition, encodes two layers of meaning in a single text simultaneously. The outer layer, called the wax, is the surface meaning accessible to a listener or reader with ordinary understanding. The inner layer, called the gold, is the hidden meaning accessible only to those trained to perceive it. The tradition of chin training in Ethiopian church schools is centuries old and produces scholars who can construct and read texts operating simultaneously on both levels, a form of linguistic and intellectual discipline with no direct equivalent in Western Christian tradition. Whether these features of the Ethiopian tradition represent what some researchers have described as encoded frequencies or harmonic recalibrations embedded in the texts is a claim that sits beyond what can be established by conventional analysis. What is established is that the tradition was built around the assumption that the physical production of sacred language in specifically designed physical spaces produces effects that go beyond the communication of information, that the body of the worshipper is changed by the experience in ways that silent reading of the same text does not produce. That assumption is embedded in every aspect of how the Ethiopian tradition was constructed and how it has been maintained. Mel Gibson and the director's cut. Mel Gibson's fascination with the Ethiopian Bible is not difficult to understand in the context of his filmmaking. The Passion of the Christ was built on a specific and controversial directorial commitment to depicting the physical reality of the crucifixion with a literalism that Western Christian art had largely avoided. The film's extended and unflinching depiction of the scourging drew criticism from reviewers who described it as excessive, and from theologians who argued that it reduced the spiritual significance of the event to its physical brutality. Gibson's response was that the physical brutality was the point, that 2,000 years of sanitized artistic representation had produced a Jesus whose suffering had been aestheticized to the point where its actual physical reality had been lost, and that recovering that physical reality required a confrontation with it that comfortable art had been avoiding. The Ethiopian Bible offered Gibson something the Western canon does not: a Jesus who is physically specific rather than aesthetically idealized. A Jesus whose appearance is described in terms drawn from the Revelation text, not softened into the gentle shepherd of European devotional painting. A Jesus who operates as a cosmic authority in a spiritual conflict of genuine stakes, not merely as a moral exemplar whose teachings should be followed. A Jesus embedded in an African genealogy and an African artistic tradition that has never been processed through the European aesthetic machine. The Ethiopian tradition represents, in Gibson's framework, the director's cut of the gospel. The version before the studio made its decisions about what the audience could handle, what needed to be softened, what needed to be made more palatable to the sensibilities of the culture that would be consuming it. The Ethiopian church made different decisions for a different audience in a different cultural context, and the result is a portrait of the same figure that is rugged and cosmic and physically specific in ways that the Western version is not. Whether Gibson's reading of the Ethiopian tradition fully captures the sophistication of what that tradition actually contains is a separate question from whether his intuition about the difference between the two portraits is correct. The intuition is correct. The Ethiopian Bible does present a Jesus whose physical reality is more specific, whose cosmic authority is more extensive, and whose connection to African history and geography is more direct than the Western canon presents. That difference is real, it is documented, and it is the product of 2,000 years of separate development by a tradition that was never subject to the institutional pressures that produced the Western version. Why this matters now. The Ethiopian Bible's relevance to the present moment is not primarily a matter of theological controversy or historical curiosity. It is a matter of what the tradition offers to people looking for a version of faith with more texture and depth than the compressed, simplified versions that Western culture has largely produced and then largely abandoned. Western Christianity's decline in the countries where it was once institutionally dominant is not primarily a decline of spiritual seeking. The hunger for meaning, for connection to something larger than ordinary experience, for a framework that can hold the full weight of human suffering and human joy, has not diminished. What has diminished is confidence that the institutional forms of Western Christianity contain what that hunger is looking for. The sanitized, simplified, aestheticized Jesus of Western tradition has not proven adequate to the weight people are bringing to the search. The Ethiopian tradition offers a different scale of figure. A Jesus who is physically present and physically specific. A Jesus whose authority extends to cosmic dimensions that ordinary moral teaching does not reach. A Jesus embedded in a continuous narrative that connects the oldest texts of the tradition to the present moment through a chain of unbroken transmission, chanted in a language specifically maintained for that purpose, in churches specifically designed to make the chanting do something to the bodies of the people participating in it. The word, as the Ethiopian tradition understands it, is still active. It is not a historical record or a theological proposition. It is a living thing, echoing in stone walls carved to shape it, in a language maintained specifically to carry it, in a tradition that has refused for 2,000 years to let it be compressed into something more manageable. What Mel Gibson recognized, and what the Ethiopian Bible demands from anyone who engages with it seriously, is that the figure at the center of the tradition was never meant to be manageable. The attempt to make him so is the history of Western Christianity. The refusal to do so is the history of the Ethiopian Church. The difference between those two histories is 81 books wide and 2,000 years deep. 81 books maintained for 2,000 years without the editing decisions of Rome or the Reformation. A Jesus described with bronze skin and hair like wool. The Book of Enoch's cosmic framework still intact. The Ark of the Covenant still guarded in Aksum. Rock-hewn churches still resonating with Ge'ez chant. Mel Gibson called it the director's cut. The Ethiopian tradition calls it what was always there. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next.